I'm Rebecca Snow, nutritionist, herbalist, and mentor. This is the Nutrition and Herbal Collective. ADIME or SOAP? It's a common question I get from new members of our mentorship program. Really, there's no right or wrong. There's pros and cons to both, but charting can be really stressful. It's definitely one of the most stressful things that my mentees and members talk about. When you're chilling at home, talking to your mom, but then remember all the stuff you forgot to chart. Yep. Have you ever gotten to the end of your week and you're all done with your clinical consults, but you've got 5 to 8 charting notes to write up, and each one takes you about an hour? That's how a lot of people get behind on their paperwork. Charting can be really stressful. So the key is finding a rhythm that works for you, notes that are simple enough that you can get them done in a timely manner. So let's explore that. This is a copy of my notes pre-2010. I used to do handwritten notes. I've been in practice since 2003. And for many years, I had handwritten notes. Sometimes a new graduate I'm working with is embarrassed to show me their handwritten notes, and I will say, don't worry about it. You should, this is even a fairly organized, clean copy of something that I used to do prior to typing up my notes. And hard to really navigate that. Ultimately, I ended up using Word docs and printing them off and putting them in the chart. And now I use Healthy for electronic health or medical records. And that's been a game changer for me. But what's the purpose of charting? The purpose is to keep clean, organized documentation of your client visit so that you can remember what happened the last time you saw a client. You might need those notes to share with another practitioner, to their doctor. If you do participate with insurance, you're going to need those notes to potentially share with the insurance company. But ultimately, it's an objective record and document. It's not meant to be a novel to document what occurred in the session. What's the most important part of the charting note? I would say it's the assessment. That is the part that a lot of new graduates like to skip over. They take notes about the client, create a plan, but the assessment is what links the information you're collecting about the client with the plan you're creating. It's the window into your brain. What is your justification for your recommendations? It's really important because you have to then think through the case and decide, what do I think about this client and why am I recommending what I'm recommending? How long should your charting take? I have seen new graduates take 10 hours on an ADIME or SOAP note, and although this is good for hours, it's bad for business. And what you learn in academic settings, very detailed research-based charting notes, is often not practical for clinical practice. My goal for myself and what I try to adhere to is 15 minutes outside the appointment for follow-up visits and no more than an hour outside the visit for a new patient consult. New patient consults don't always take me an hour outside the visit. It does depend on how much there is to go through, how many labs they've shared, how much medical history to pour through. So which is better, ADIME or SOAP? One is not better than the other. There's pros and cons to both, so let's look at that. ADIME. So there's a lot of different examples of ADIMEs out there. We share a couple examples of both SOAP and ADIME in our shared resources as a part of our mentorship program and the clinical immersion. So our members can utilize a format that works for them. There's also formats you can find online if you do a Google search, looking for various templates and finding one that works for you. You might be in a situation where you're working in an institutionalized setting or in a group practice and there's a predetermined format that you have to stick to. But if you're in private practice, ultimately you're mostly the only one that's going to see those notes. So you want to have a format that works for you. ADIME is very guided. It's fill in the blank. So it's great for new practitioners because it reminds you to document different areas. It is the standard documentation for licensed nutritionist dietitians. So in that sense, it's medical nutrition therapy focused because you are giving your client a nutrition diagnosis. Um, and it's useful in group practice, institutionalized setting because it is the standard documentation for dietitians, licensed nutritionists. It does provide a very thorough assessment. So it's going through labs, NFPE, anthropometrics, medical diagnosis, signs and symptoms. I would say the cons to ADIME is that it's not a good form in red states where scope of practice is limited, because in a red state such as Alabama or other in the middle of the country on the nutrition advocacy site, a nutritionist doesn't have full scope of practice and can't practice medical nutrition therapy. So using a form like this would put one in a liability because you'd be using terms like diagnosis and medical diagnosis, etc. I would say one of the cons is that there's no space for narrative because it's very fill in the blank oriented. There's not a space just to jot notes about the client's relationships or the client, maybe the client just lost a dog or has a busy work schedule. And you want to document some of that narrative because it informs your recommendations. And I would say now, this particular example is very simple. There are other examples that are 2 pages long with multiple charts, boxes, hundreds of places to add data. A very complex ADIME note is very hard to fill out during a consult, whereas something like this ADIME note actually would be fairly easy to fill out during a consult. This is a modified version of what one of my members a few years ago used in clinical practice, and she finished her notes in the session with the client, which was super useful because she had a very busy practice. And then let's look at SOAP note. This is the example of my SOAP note before I transitioned to electronic health records through Healthy. I was using Microsoft Word documents, printing them off and keeping them in a hard copy chart. I would have in a HIPAA compliant folder in Google Drive, I would save the Microsoft Word document so I could pull that data over to the next note when I saw the client again. That was my old-fashioned homemade version of electronic health records. Now it's much more streamlined. But this is an example of a SOAP note. SOAP notes don't have to have all the blue subheadings under subjective, objective, assessment, and plan don't have to be so delineated. It could just be blank subjective area, a blank objective area, a blank assessment, and a blank plan. That would be the simplest version of a SOAP note. If you use these large blank areas in a charting note like this, it's very fluid for writing content and narrative. So you can, if you're talking to a client virtually, you can be typing in their note while you're talking to them, taking notes. It is super simple, or it could be more tailored. You could put boxes in here for NFPE, for supplements and medications that you fill in for anthropometrics, or it could be very general and open the way this one is, where you just have sections you're filling in. Another pro of SOAP notes is it is a universal charting method across professions. So medical doctors use it, naturopaths use it, coaches use it. And it's more useful when scope of practice is limited. So if you do have to practice more as a coach or an educator, you can take out words like diagnosis. You can, in your assessment, you can keep it very broad. Client needs education about fiber, or client needs education about stress reduction techniques, where you're not actually making a claim that the client eats a low fiber diet. That would lend itself much better to scope in certain red states. Some of the cons of the SOAP note is because it doesn't have all the fill-in boxes, it is a little harder for a new practitioner to remember. It doesn't have the prompts. Some of the ADIME formats will have prompts around body systems, so that you're remembering to check those boxes off. It's also less data oriented. It's a little less oriented towards taking anthropometric measurements, doing your NFPE, identifying drug nutrient depletions interactions. You can still do all those things. It's not guided within the template to document that data. So those are my pros and cons. I want to leave you with 5 tips for easier charting. Number 1, use the charting method that works for you. One charting method is not universal and for everybody. I think the most important thing is to use what you're comfortable with. There's a lot of learning curve when you're first starting your practice, starting your business. There's a lot of things happening, getting your LLC together, your website, acquiring clients, getting comfortable seeing clients out on your own. So it might not be the time to switch up your charting method when you first start your practice. You can also try different methods and see what you like. Number 2, you do not have to write a PES statement for your assessment. There's lots of assessment models outside of the PES statement. A lot of people learned that in school and feel like they need to stick with it. Feel free to comment, and I'm happy to share with you some other assessment tools you could use. Number 3, use EMR or EHR or homemade EMR or EHR for pre-filled notes. So I use Healthy, Sunny uses Practice Better. I have members of our program use both. Some people don't use anything. For many years, as I said, I just used Microsoft Word documents, and I would carry over the information from the last visit to pre-fill, so I didn't have to write the entire note from scratch. It saves a huge amount of time to have pre-filled notes because a lot of the data on a client doesn't change from week 1 to week 3. Their drugs are the same, their medical history is the same, their family history is the same. It'll save you a lot of time to use that. Number 4, chart during your appointment. Whatever format you use, you want to use something that you can fill out while you're talking to the client. Particularly now that most people are working 100% virtually, it is very easy to listen to a client and type at the same time. And then last but not least, I would finish your charting notes the day of the appointment or the next day. I would make sure you have time in your schedule to do all your charting notes as quickly as possible, because when they pile up, it gets really stressful, particularly when you're trying to complete your internship hours. There's a lot of things you're thinking about, and if you get behind in your charting notes, it can start to feel really overwhelming. I have 15 minutes between my appointments, which helps. It gives me a little buffer in case we're running late, and then I can also do some cleaning up of my notes. I try and chart as much as I can while I'm talking to a client, and then I'll clean it up afterwards. Another good thing to think about is if your notes are really taking you like 2 to 3 hours, you might be trying to do too much in the first visit. So chunk it down. Food first on the first visit, maybe focus on their dietary analysis, on signs and symptoms, and hold off on even evaluating their medications and supplements till the second visit. And then maybe do your drug nutrient drug interactions, depletions analysis on that second visit, just so you're not trying to do so much, particularly if the client hasn't committed to working with you. You don't want to invest hours and hours and hours of time on that first visit. Now, when you're first starting out, you want to do research, you want to grow and learn, and so it's totally reasonable to invest time in research if you want to. All right. Thank you all for your listening, and I look forward to answering any questions you have. Bye.